They called it the mercy rope, a tool so holy it could tear your body apart without spilling a single drop of blood. For centuries, the Vatican erased every trace of it, terrified the world would learn what they'd done in God's name. This wasn't punishment. It was obedience, disguised as faith. Victims begged for death. One woman survived 14 rounds, and the church made her a saint to hide the crime. 600 years later, the rope still whispers from the archives. Because what if the greatest sin the church ever committed was calling torture divine? During the 13th to 15th centuries, the Catholic Church developed interrogation methods that avoided shedding blood, as canon law strictly forbade it. One of these methods became known as the rope torture, or the strappado. It was considered a clean punishment, designed to force confessions without visible wounds. Church officials believed this approach was merciful compared to burning or mutilation, but in reality, it caused unbearable pain and permanent injury. Victims were told that by confessing quickly they could save their souls, yet few survived the process intact. This device, simple in appearance, became a symbol of cruelty, hidden behind religious justification. They called it merciful because it drew no blood, but the victims wished it had. The church's records described the process in careful detail, but never revealed how the rope truly worked. To understand the horror, we must look at how this so-called mercy was carried out. The church justified torture through a religious framework that viewed confession as the only path to salvation. In their reasoning, forcing someone to admit their sins, even through pain, was an act of mercy that could save their soul from eternal damnation. The Inquisition operated under strict canon law, which stated, ecclesiastical authorities must not shed blood. This rule meant that methods involving cutting or open wounds were forbidden. But pain itself was not. So, inquisitors created ways to inflict suffering without breaking the law. They convinced themselves that physical agony could purify the spirit. Rope torture fit perfectly into this logic. It caused excruciating pain, yet left no visible blood, allowing them to claim moral purity while committing acts of brutality. So they found a way to destroy the body, without a single drop spilled. To see how this twisted idea became practice, we need to examine the device itself. The rope torture, formerly called the strappado, was a simple yet devastating device. The victims' hands were tied tightly behind their back, and a rope was looped around their wrists. This rope ran upward through a pulley fixed to the ceiling or a high beam. When the rope was pulled, the person was lifted into the air by their bound arms, forcing the shoulders to twist unnaturally behind them. Tribunal manuals and records from inquisitorial courts describe this as a standard method for extracting confessions. Even the Malleus Maleficarum, a 15th-century guide for identifying and punishing witches, includes detailed references to this procedure. It was presented as a measured way to test a suspect's truthfulness without spilling blood. In practice, it caused immediate dislocation of the shoulders, tearing of ligaments, and long-term paralysis. The design required almost no equipment, yet it produced extreme pain and terror. It sounds simple, until you realize what happens inside the human body when it begins. But the true cruelty of the strappado came from its stages of escalation. Inquisitors did not stop after the first lift. Each level increased the suffering with calculated precision, and those levels determined who lived, who broke, and who died. In the first stage of the strappado, the victim was hoisted just high enough that their feet barely touched the ground. The tension on the rope forced their arms upward and backward, instantly straining the shoulder joints. Within minutes, the ligaments tore, and both shoulders often dislocated. Tribunal records from Toledo describe victims crying out that their arms were on fire, while inquisitors calmly noted, "Subject shows signs of resistance but remains conscious." To church officials, this position resembled open wings and was cynically referred to as angel's wings. They claimed it symbolized purification through suffering. The victims, however, experienced only agony and humiliation. Many fainted only to be revived and lifted again. Every confession or cry was carefully recorded as proof that the method was working. The church called it angel's wings. The victims called it something else, hell. Yet for some, even this torment was not enough to make them speak. And when the first level failed to produce a confession, the inquisitors turned to a far crueler solution. They began to add weight. When a prisoner refused to confess after the first suspension, inquisitors increased the pressure through a second stage known as the weighted descent. They attached stones or iron weights, usually between 25 and 50 pounds, to the victim's ankles. The additional force pulled the body downward while the arms remained bound behind the back, stretching the spine and chest far beyond normal limits. Tribunal records from Spain mention this stage lasting precisely 1 hour, a period believed to balance mercy with effectiveness. Scribes documented the minutes carefully, noting the moment a confession was made or when the subject lost consciousness. The pain was unbearable. Ribs separated, lungs compressed, and breathing became shallow and frantic. Some victims begged to die rather than speak, while others confessed to anything just to make it stop. The Church described these confessions as voluntary. In reality, gravity became their executioner. Yet a few prisoners still refused to break, and their silence forced the inquisitors to push the limits of their so-called mercy even further. What came next tested not only the human body but also the Church's own idea of faith. The final stage of the rope torture was known among inquisitors as the hour of judgment. At this point, weights of nearly 100 pounds were tied to the victim's ankles. The pull was so violent that it separated vertebrae and tore muscle fibers along the back and shoulders. Some victims fainted within seconds, only to be revived with water and forced to endure it again. A record from the Toledo archives mentions Elena of Cordoba, who withstood 3 lifts before losing all movement in her arms. The scribe wrote coldly, "She remains obstinate in silence." Few ever reached this point. Most either confessed or died before it. But those who did left marks in history so horrifying that later Church officials quietly removed these details from manuals and archives. Most never reached this stage, but those who did changed Church law forever. One of them not only survived, she defied the Inquisition itself. Apollonia of Alexandria became one of the most famous victims of rope torture, not for what she confessed, but for what she refused to say. Accused of heresy and witchcraft, she was subjected to the Strapado 14 separate times. Each session followed the same brutal pattern: suspension by the wrists, dislocation, fainting, revival, and interrogation. Records from her trial describe her as unshaken, though her arms hung lifeless. Despite unbearable agony, Apollonia never confessed, never betrayed anyone, and never accepted guilt for crimes she did not commit. Even her inquisitors began to doubt their purpose. One entry notes that, after the 14th suspension, she spoke prayers instead of pleas. Witnesses claimed that her calmness terrified them more than her screams ever had. After session 14, even her torturers believed something divine was happening. Her endurance forced the Church to confront its own contradiction. A system built to save souls was destroying them instead. The question now was how the Church would handle the aftermath of such a miracle of resistance. Apollonia's survival placed the Vatican in an impossible position. If she had died under torture, her death could have been dismissed as another tragic necessity of faith. But she lived, and worse, she did so without confessing. This created a theological crisis. The Church had long claimed that truth always emerged under divine guidance. Therefore, the innocent would confess, and the guilty would perish. Apollonia's endurance shattered that logic. If she was guilty, why had God spared her? And if she was innocent, what did that say about the Holy Office that tortured her? To avoid public scandal, Church leaders made a calculated decision. They declared her a saint, framing her suffering as a divine test of faith rather than an indictment of the Inquisition. They couldn't admit she exposed the system, so they canonized her instead. But even sainthood couldn't erase the evidence. To truly protect the Church's image, something far more deliberate had to be done. They buried every trace of what had happened. For nearly 6 centuries, the Vatican kept the details of rope torture hidden from public view. Inquisition records were sealed, trial notes redacted, and many original documents quietly destroyed. The official explanation was that such materials were unsuitable for theological study. In truth, the Church feared what these pages revealed, not heresy, but hypocrisy. Only fragments survived, preserved by accident in regional archives across Spain and Italy. When historians finally accessed parts of the Vatican's secret archive in the 19th century, they found brief mentions of the strappado buried among coded entries. Every reference to the method ended abruptly, replaced by phrases like procedura sancta, the holy procedure. When the files finally resurfaced, one pattern was unmistakable: silence was policy. Yet through these fragments, scholars discovered that torture had served a darker function than confession alone. Its real purpose was about control, not truth. Modern historians and psychologists now see the Strapado not as a tool for uncovering truth, but as an early form of psychological warfare. The procedure's design, public, prolonged, and humiliating, wasn't meant to reveal hidden heresy. It was meant to break the human spirit. Victims learned that resistance only brought more pain, while obedience offered brief relief. This conditioned absolute submission, a method far more effective than logic or persuasion. Records show that even witnesses, not just prisoners, left these chambers changed, fearful, compliant, and silent. The Church called it interrogation, but it functioned as indoctrination. It wasn't truth they wanted, it was obedience. The goal wasn't confession, it was control, and that control didn't vanish when the torture ended. Its influence seeped into law, faith, and governance for generations to come, shaping how power itself was understood and enforced. The legacy of the rope torture extended far beyond the walls of the Inquisition. Communities learned to police themselves, driven by fear of even the slightest suspicion. A careless word, a strange dream, or an unpopular opinion could invite accusation. People began to confess before they were even questioned, hoping to avoid the fate they had witnessed. Women suffered the most, often branded as witches or heretics for defying social expectations. The Strapado became more than a device. It became a symbol of obedience enforced through terror. Even when the ropes were gone, the fear remained. Generations grew up believing that silence was safety and conformity was faith. You didn't need ropes to control people, just the memory of them. That memory still lingers, echoing in the ways institutions use fear and authority to shape behavior today. The method changed, but the mechanism stayed the same. The story of the rope torture is not just a relic of medieval cruelty. It's a mirror reflecting how power survives. The Inquisition proved that control doesn't require weapons or blood, only the ability to shape truth through fear. By redefining pain as purification and obedience as faith, the Church turned torture into theology. Today, the same logic appears in different forms: psychological pressure, forced confessions, and systems that punish dissent while calling it justice. Institutions still protect themselves by rewriting their own history, just as the Vatican buried the rope's legacy for 600 years. What this reveals is timeless. When authority goes unquestioned, truth becomes whatever power allows it to be. 6 centuries later, the rope still teaches the same lesson. Control begins when fear replaces truth. And perhaps the hardest question remains, one that history forces us to ask: what would you have done if silence meant survival?